My iPhone photo file is full of fish. But the fish are always accompanied by smiling young faces. In it, there are some impressive salmon, but most of the fish are trout, either laid out in rows on green grass or held as high as they could by stubby little arms with proud, smiling faces. When you take a child fishing, these are the memories that you hope for. The photos of steam rising off the hot chocolate, or a confused look at tangled, bundled fishing line, those are good memories too. But you hope for the joy of catching fish. We had an annual parent-child fishing event at a camp I worked at when our kids were growing up. There was a large pond connected to an even much larger county lake with a gate between them that you could raise and lower. And a week or so before the annual fishing event, a large truck with a big stainless steel tank on the back would show up, back up to the pond. A very long, clear, big plastic bag type thing would be attached to the side, and with the lift of a lever, 500 trout would slide down and disperse into the pond, quickly going to the deeper spaces. If you brought the fish in right before the event, which was a mistake I made a couple times, they wouldn't be hungry enough to bite on that first Saturday morning. But if you brought them in early enough, a week or so, they'd be hungry enough to bite any bit of power bait, potski egg, or plastic doodad that you would throw into the pond. So imagine dozens of families surrounding the pond at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and it was wonderfully chaotic. Young people smiling and reeling, parents untangling and rebaiting. And I would make the same joke every year that it wasn't really fishing, it was catching. Whatever fish the families couldn't eat were released back into the lake by opening the gate. At least those that the ospreys and the eagles didn't dive for right in front of us. It was an event that was almost as dramatic as our gospel story today. Peter and his friends have been out fishing when it makes sense for them to fish. Imagine at night, the lanterns hung on their boats, the light attracting small fish and other organisms to the surface for the larger fish to come rise and bite. The weather is cooler in the top of the water now as the fish rise to shallow areas, and it's cooler for the fishermen as well. If you fish at night, the catch is ready to be sold first thing in the morning as people prepare for their day. Peter has done everything that makes sense. But it's in a moment of failure, of not being able to provide for his family for the day, that Peter meets Jesus. He sits and he listens in the boat behind Jesus as Jesus talks about God's kingdom, the way the world is supposed to work. In his weariness, he responds to Jesus' request to go out again, out into the deeper waters. And at the catch of fish, Peter realizes something about himself. And he realizes something about Jesus. Because what has happened to Peter defies everything that he knows. What happened shows Jesus is different. In Epiphany, we're confronted with the divinity of Jesus and have to figure out how we are going to respond. Peter has the same kind of experience, I think, that Isaiah did in our Old Testament reading this morning. When we get a glimpse of the glory of God, it may be brief, but it's so far greater than our ability to grasp. And we see our smallness next to God's unending expansiveness. We see our limits next to God's immeasurable being. So it's humbling. It's overwhelming. God's presence with us reveals God's immeasurable love for us, but also our inadequacy. And we don't like that feeling. Inadequacy. We train ourselves up to be self-reliant, self-confident, successful, things that are going to help us be of value in the world, and that's not all bad. Few things feel as good as a hard day's work. But God designed us to have limits. The truth is, we're designed to need God. Our self-confidence, our personal power aren't where we should be relying on as we're people who follow Jesus. Instead, our human limitations are not failures to overcome, but instead are divinely given gifts that shape our dependence on God. And by embracing our limitations, we're led to greater humility, wisdom, and faithfulness in our relationship with Jesus and our relationship with others. As I sat in seminary classes about the Old Testament, over and over again I was hit with the thought that in all these Old Testament stories of battles, exiles, and rebuilding, all that God really wants is for people to see that they need God. The place of our fears, of our inadequacies, our weakness, our not knowing what to do. These are just the places where Jesus says to us, "Come out to the deeper water with me. Don't be afraid. Come past these hard places to where the fishing leads to catching. Don't be afraid." Don't be afraid of what, Jesus? I ask. The three things come to mind. We need to not be afraid of who God has made us to be, just as we are. We're complicated people. Underneath what others see, we may be afraid of failure, rejection, may be afraid of responsibility. We can also be afraid of our success and the changes and exposure that it brings. But God made us all in the divine image, uniquely good, and with good gifts and calls to follow through our lives. We're just supposed to exercise those in relationship with God from an understanding of the beautiful limitations we have. Without God, there's no catching in whatever we're doing. So we need to be unafraid of who God has made us to be, gifts and limitations. We are asked to take up the space that God has given us, following where God leads. Second, when it comes to the tasks before us, we're often burdened by everything we feel we should be doing. Rather, what we should be mindful of is doing what we can control and finding peace and letting the rest go to God. This way we can find joy in what we do. We can rest when we need to. We can engage the help of others and not live in a cycle of fear that distracts us from how God is already involved and ahead of us in everything that we look to do. Finally, we need to not be afraid of God's transforming power to make us who God is calling us to be. When Peter says, "Get away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." He's not telling Jesus to walk away on the water because he hasn't seen that yet. And Jesus isn't going anywhere. What happens is that Peter feels his own limits, his inadequacy, and Jesus' provision. I come here and kneel over there to the place of confession, not because I'm supposed to, but because I have things to confess. Things that I've done in community, in my heart or my mind, that separate me relationally from the community of God. I've built up walls that I need God to take down. I'm not loving my neighbor as myself. I come to confess what I've done, what I have left undone, and what has been done in my name. And I come to the table for the transforming power of God's grace at work in my life, calling me to remember and live out my baptismal covenant and relationship with God and others, nurturing the love that flows between us. St. Thomas, where are we feeling our limits? Where do we feel them in our individual lives? Where do we feel him in that common work that we do here together in church, in our relationships? Peter's transition from a failed day at work to being the rock on who Jesus would build his church was pretty quick. Unafraid, he got up and he followed Jesus. Don't be afraid. Follow Jesus to the deeper waters, for the catching is good.